Good evening and welcome to the 17th version of Avalanche Canada's webinar series. My name is Brent Strand and I'm your producer for the evening. Nancy Geismar is online and she's going to be our moderator, looking out for your questions in the comments and chat box. We're stoked to have you folks here tonight. Many of you have been turning in through the webinar series since October. COVID has meant that we're not delivering face-to-face outreach events this year, which is a shame, but with that, the silver lining has been that we've been able to reach so many more people through these online presentations. Our mission is to help people get educated out in the backcountry so users like you can go out and play safe. We all want you to know more, go farther, and come home. We're super thankful for our sponsors that have helped us out through these challenging financial economic times and working with us to reach so many people such as yourselves and helping to get the message out to backcountry users this winter. With that being said, all you folks come in today, you're all muted automatically. There's going to be opportunities later on after the presentation to ask questions. If you want to ask a verbal question, you can just raise your hand on the raise your hand feature there. Otherwise, just type them into the question and answer box there. So tonight's presentation, we're set out to answer why is March the deadliest month. There's several factors that contribute to this. One is that usually by March, we have a very complex snowpack full of multiple weak layers. In March, we start to get warming, with the ambient air temperature, and snowpack temperatures get warm. With this warming, that can destabilize the snowpack. And finally, with the warmer and longer days, we see more people venturing out into the backcountry. The sun can make people feel good, but sometimes not lead to good decision making. We've been dealing with the COVID for over a year now, or I guess today's a year, and people have got the COVID fatigue, and everyone wants to get out, get that great escape, go out for that adventure in the outdoors, and human factors are a huge consideration in staying safe. It's super important that you stay safe and diligent with your decision making. So both presenters tonight, you might be familiar with if you've been watching the webinars. They've done a few with us this year. Grant Helgeson, he's a senior forecaster and project manager at Avalanche Canada, who makes good decisions 99% of the time, he says. If he's not working or playing in the hills, he's probably lusting over some fancy bikes or Google Earth skiing your favorite lines. Grant's going to be presenting on the big picture tonight on what's happening in the snowpack and what to be aware of not only this March, but every spring. He's going to be followed by our South Rockies field tech, Jennifer Coulter, who's going to present on tips on how to manage your backcountry mindset coming up this spring. Jen has been a key member of our South Rockies field team for the past 9 years, and Jen also teaches courses for the Canadian Avalanche Association and instructs search and rescue dogs in avalanche, wilderness, and tracking profile. With that being said, folks, I just want to run a couple polls here just to see what you folks, what's your preferred method of travel out there for accessing the backcountry? Are you guys skiers? Are you boarders? Do you snowshoe? Do you snowmobile, snowbike? Are you ice climbers? Just want to get a handle on what we're up against here and who we're talking to out there. It's great to see. We have like 100 people on right now. Hopefully we're going to get a few more come in. So it looks like the majority of folks are skiers and boarders. With that being said, we also got a bunch of folks that are some snowshoers and hikers out there. And looks like a couple ice climbers and maybe a few sledders out there as well. So that's a good one. And then the next question I'm going to ask you guys, what's your Avi Savvy? Like, what's your training? Have you guys taken a course? Have you watched a little webinar like this or sat into a little session one day for a couple hours? You AST1 holders or getting that extra education with your AST2, or are you guys actually gone to the pro level? Looks like we got a lot of folks here with some basic training, and then we got a ton of folks with AST1, AST2. This is great, fantastic group of folks out there. We got a good mix. Got a few folks with just a little bit of education, but that's good. You got to start somewhere, and then we got a few pros out here. So that's good. Awesome. And then one more question we're going to ask is, what region do you guys primary ride in? And that's going to be based on our forecast regions. We kind of grouped them up here. So looks like we've got a lot of folks coming from the coast, the Rockies, some folks in the interior here. Yeah, looks like we got a good mix. few less folks up in the North Coast and the North Rockies region. That being said, it looks like 50% of you guys are coming at us from the Rockies area. Awesome. Well, thanks for giving us some information, get a little bit of an idea on who we're talking to and who's attending this evening. So with that being said, folks, I'm going to hand it over to Grant, and he's going to start us off with his presentation for the evening. Take it away, Grant.
Great, thanks, Brent. I'll just get my screens queued up here. So it turns out only 5% of you are from the Northwest, and that appears to be the only place that it's going to snow ever again. So the rest of you guys can get really warm, and we'll talk about that in greater detail here. And I will get this into the full screen. I'm giving away my secrets. There we go. Okay. How are we looking there, Brent? Can we see everything?
You're looking good. Ides of March.
The Ides of March. Any scholars out there that can talk about where the Ides of March, that term actually comes from? You know, it's one of the few things that snow professionals quote from Shakespeare. We're going to get into that in just a second. We're going to go through the state of the snowpack. It's going to talk about what's happening with the snowpack around the province. Talk a little bit about deeply buried weak layers and us, and what we can do there and what we don't feel, what we do feel. Human factors like blue sky syndrome and, of course, COVID fatigue. Forecasting warming, how difficult that actually is. And then we'll get into what happens next and hand it off to Jen for where the rubber meets the road there, which is going to be awesome. So the Ides of March, this is obviously the murder of Caesar. And beware the Ides of March, something that is just like, I've been in this industry for about 15 years now, and people are always saying this in March. And historically, it is one of the most dangerous and deadly months. But why is that? You would think that later in the season, the snowpacks mature, the days are long, we're all tuned up, we've been riding and making decisions all season. But in fact, there's some real problems with March. And we'll get into some more of that right now. But it's a weird and difficult thing to predict what happens with a nice cold winter snowpack as it moves into that warm spring snowpack. It's difficult from a public forecasting perspective. It's difficult to make decisions on the ground. It's difficult to anticipate how quickly things warm up or don't. So we're going to get into all that right now. So just looking a little bit about around the snowpack around the province, well, gosh, there's a lot of low out there. You know, you're just kind of seeing moderate winds. That's for the wind slabs that are remaining in the alpine throughout the province. It's a little bit different in the Yukon and the Northwest coast. They're just getting hammered with snow right now, and it's still going to be, you know, some great blower March skiing in that part of the world. But for the rest of the province, we're actually looking at a pretty nice snowpack this year. And in fact, there aren't a lot of scary weak layers in our snowpack this year, but we're going to get into in a second, is that sometimes these things come back to haunt us a little bit. And when you start to dig into the details just a little bit more, you start to see things like this. So here we are in the South Rockies, and we're talking about some deeply buried weak layers. So here we're talking about the upper weak layer is down 60 centimeters, another deeper one down 60 to 100 centimeters. And I just want to stop and think about that for a second. Like what does a 100 centimeter deep avalanche crown look like? Is that the kind of avalanche that you can survive or manage? I mean, for that matter, is a 60 centimeter deep avalanche problem? Is that something you can manage? Sure, you can manage it, but it's real tough to feel it underneath your skis or sled or snowshoes. It just feels bomber, and that's kind of where some of the problem come from. So this is a little bit of a go. I'm going to give this a shot here. Yes.
ECTP 30, right on the edge, and it broke on the depth or hit the ground. So is it getting better? Well, it's not as sensitive as it was, but still not psyched.
Still not psyched. That's Doug Chabot. He's the director of the Gallatin National Forest down in Bozeman, Montana, the Avalanche Center down there. And Doug is a certified badass. He's a Patagonia athlete. He's climbed in the Himalaya. And that's a spooky snowpack. And just for fun, I just want to start the first part of this over again and think about that. That's terrifying. Like, what do you do when you have a real deeply buried weak layer like that is still susceptible to snowpack tests? What happens when it warms up 1 degree or 2 degrees? Or you have your first overnight refreeze? The fact of the matter is you really can't trust a snowpack like that. And thankfully, that's not really what we're dealing with around here this year. But we'll see what happens. We start to get into a few nights without a refreeze as we move into spring. Oh, getting dug again. Because these deeply buried weak layers, we start to lose track of them. You know, layers that were buried in November, December, into January. It's real easy to stop thinking about them because the riding has been so good. We're not seeing lots of avalanches on those interfaces. And we're pretty well programmed to deal with things on the surface. You know, and as the snowpack warms up too, the penetration that we have when we're out there walking or skiing or sledding the mountains, we actually impact lower layers in the snowpack because it warms up. So it's possible for us to trigger deeper avalanches. And then of course, as we start to get into the spring, it starts to warm up, we're actually getting free water percolating through the snowpack. It starts to lubricate up some of those more deeply buried weak layers. And then kind of all bets are off. And Jen's going to talk about what we can do to mitigate some of those challenges in a little bit here. You know, it's just the nature of deep slab avalanches. It has to, of course, release on a deeply buried weak layer. And those, while they're not widespread in the province, they are out there. This is actually in the Hassler region in the North Rockies. And that's a big wall-to-wall avalanche. And that's one of the challenges in the spring is that these avalanches can start to move across terrain features. So you might only have small avalanches when there's not a deep enough snowpack that, you know, a rock rib or something like you'll see in here. Oh, there we go. So, you know, a feature like this might only go this big in the midwinter, or it might just be confined to one of these little chutes. But now the snowpack is deep and it can connect multiple features like this big bowl. This is from the same day, which is actually just yesterday, where you're seeing really deep wall-to-wall avalanches. And this is one of the classic things that can happen in the spring because you have a nice contiguous snow surface here that goes all along a feature like this. You might trigger it from a thin spot like this, and then boom, it's breaking all around you. Or maybe you're down here shivering in the shade, and that strong March sun is there, kind of spilling over, warming up that cornice. It falls down. You've got these large natural avalanches that can happen. So spring can be a really challenging time. You know, and I think like when it's warm out there in the mountains and we're just feeling so good, it's like, what's the worst that can happen out there? I've certainly felt this many times, and I know after a long season of work and play, I'm usually pretty excited to be out in the spring, and I find myself just feeling like this. It's like, yeah, bring on spring, bring on summer. And when you're feeling like this, it's so difficult to anticipate that there may be a very real and very large avalanche cycle just waiting to happen. Or maybe the human triggered avalanches are just a little bit more likely to happen after you stop and had a beer on that ridge. So it's a time to start to keep your guard up. That's kind of what we're drilling down to here. And this is an especially interesting spring because, you know, I think, are you feeling COVID fatigued? Well, heck yeah, I'm feeling pretty COVID fatigued. You know, how's that impacting our decision making out there in the mountains? Does anyone feel like it's time to cut loose or want to real bad or wants to finally go on that vacation? Or maybe just out there going pow skiing just sounds so good. We're getting out in some big spring ski mountaineering lines. I mean, I think that we're all feeling that. It's been really interesting to read a few different avalanche reports from the States of incidents that have happened down there. And I've heard people say this, they just feel like the cumulative stress from dealing with COVID or all this anxiety and uncertainty is actually impacting their ability to make good decisions in the backcountry. And I think that's something we should be talking about openly amongst our backcountry partners. So what happens next? Well, throughout the province, we're actually getting into a pretty significant warm up. And of course, on our forecast, you've got the danger ratings, the avalanche problems. Then you come over here to details, and you'll get that quick synopsis of the weather. And the forecaster on duty has done a lot of work to put together that nice, tight consensus about what's going to happen with the weather. But digging just a little bit deeper, these are some of the products that we look at. So on the left, this is all height in meters. This line is the freezing line. And you can see like right now the freezing level is kind of going up to 1,500 meters and then dropping back down tonight. And then it creeps back up again tomorrow and then drops back down Saturday morning. But it's going to go from, you know, about 1,500 meter high today up to 1,800 meters. And then by Saturday afternoon, it's looking at 2,500 meters. Now this is for the South Columbia, but unless you're in the North Rockies or the Northwest Inland or the Northwest Coast or Yukon, this is kind of what's going to happen over the next few days here. So you have a big rising freezing level, and we're not going to get such a good overnight recovery, meaning the snow surface isn't expected to refreeze everywhere. Some places it'll refreeze, but maybe not in your drainage. So it's really important to start thinking about, what does the snow feel like? Is it a nice, firm, supportive crust and it's refrozen? Or are we looking at loose snow that didn't freeze overnight? Because that's when we can start getting into some of these larger avalanches. So we're going to be out there testing the snowpack, observing with our field teams, looking at all the observations. But the reality is that snowpack tests just don't do a great job at helping us understand the impact of warming until it's kind of too late. So you've got to sort of take what you've got there in the snowpack and then think and extrapolate, like, what's going to happen when it gets a few degrees warmer on this slope. It's a challenging time, and it makes for some really interesting discussions in our office. And so what happens next? Well, peak warming may initiate a natural avalanche cycle, especially in the east and places where there's a little bit thinner snowpack, where you have deeper weak layers and deeper concerns in the snowpack. And so this is a challenging time. What happens next is kind of the big question mark, and it doesn't really matter so much as long as we've got good travel habits out there and as long as we're thinking and observing in the mountains. So I'm going to hand it off to my dear friend and colleague, someone who I've got a lot of great mentorship from in the backcountry and who I personally just look up to a ton, who spends a lot more time in the field than I do these days, and he'll have some great information for us to think about how do we manage these things going into the spring period. I'll hand it over to you, Jen.
Hey, Grant, before you go, I've got a question from Lo. Where did you get or find that freezing level chart that you showed?
Top secret. No, that one, if you Google search Avalanche Canada Meteogram, you'll find that one actually. Also, spot weather is a great place if you want to go and fine tune and look at some different, those are called meteograms. If you want to look at some of those for your individual area, you can go to spot weather and you can actually choose which product you want to go look at. And so there's a number of different weather models you can go and hunt around for, but be really careful with those too, because it's easy to look at one of those and think you know exactly what's going to happen. But unless you have a good understanding of the larger weather pattern, it can suck you into some false precision. So yeah, careful with that.
That's great. Thanks, guys.
Hello, everyone. Brent or Nancy, is my screen looking okay to you?
Good to go.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Grant. I thought we would look at something a little bit different at this webinar and talk about March and mindsets. So let's kind of jump right in there. So, maybe we're going to look at how we can stay safe through this statistically most dangerous month. And we're going to do a quick review kind of the daily process. And then I'm hoping to spark your curiosity about developing or adopting a terrain mindset when you do your trip planning. And I'm going to show some examples from field work, from being an Avalanche Canada field technician, of using different mindsets. And I'll give some examples starting from February, moving into March, and then a little bit of a look at some mindsets we might encounter or we might adopt, for the future. And then I'm just going to do a little touch on some trip planning tools that we've been using kind of to just double check some of our trip plans through some tricky times. So if March is a statistically dangerous month for avalanches, it kind of behooves us not to get lazy about our trip planning. And I think it's safe to say that risk fatigue is a real thing, what Grant talked about, that kind of double whammy of the global pandemic and kind of keeping up safe practices in every part of our life, as well as in avalanche terrain, can seem quite overwhelming. So making sure that we're approaching the day systematically can kind of help to ensure we're reaching our goal of enjoying the backcountry and what it has to offer, which is quite frankly a lot right now in COVID. But making sure that we come home safely so that we can do it all over again. And as a field technician, we use a daily process very similar to this every day we go into avalanche terrain. If the idea of the daily process is new to you, We're going to drop a link in the chat box to Avi Savvy, where it talks kind of about this daily process, so you can look further into it. So kind of we start with, getting the forecast and gathering information about the potential avalanche hazard, maybe some weather research as well. Eventually we get to planning our trip and checking our gear, and these are all done, before we go into the backcountry. Once we're in the field, we need to make sure it's our responsibility to make sure we're verifying conditions as we go and using good travel habits, as well as evaluating the slopes that we're interacting with. And at the end, we want to reflect on our day. So, just a second. So when you start with that avalanche bulletin and getting the information of the forecast, of course, you're going to look at the headline, because that's where the forecaster really puts a lot of work into making sure they're telling you the most important information up there. You're going to check the danger ratings, and of course, the terrain and travel advice is super helpful for your trip planning on the first page. And then you're diving in to look at what kind of avalanche problems there are, maybe what elevations and aspects they can be found on. And like Grant talked about, you're going to dive into the details where you can get the information about maybe recent avalanches, that good bullseye information, and learn about what the snow is doing under the surface in the snowpack structure, and then get kind of a quick look at the weather as well. So I'm going to make a little plug here that while you're doing the first part of your daily process, that you also include looking at the Mountain Information Network, because regional avalanche forecasts, they cover diverse mountain and weather environments, and the avalanche danger could be higher than posted, in some parts of the region, and potentially lower than in others. And normally it's our daily on-site observations that help us refine the initial info we collect in the morning and apply it to a slope-specific scale when we're in the backcountry. And increasingly, because the MIN has gotten quite powerful, the MIN can supply some of that slope and drainage specific data, even in the trip planning stages. And that can be an important piece of the safety puzzle. So big thanks to everyone who's contributing there. So, okay, let's say you've reviewed the forecast and the weather and identified some avalanche problems, looked at the terrain and travel advice. Maybe now is a good time for us to think about how choosing a mindset could help us when planning our trip. I'm going to kind of put it in between here, the getting the forecast and the planning your trip, kind of step 1.5, I'm going to call it. So thinking about and choosing a mindset can help us get some of our human factors in check. And both Brent and Grant alluded to those. So maybe I'm coming at this upcoming trip with a lot of motivation and desire to get after it. I'm really chomping at the bit here, kind of like my avalanche dog feels about getting her toy. Everyone who knows me knows I have to fit some dog photos into every presentation. So how do I kind of reconcile all of that desire with the given avalanche hazard for the day that I'm developing in my morning kind of trip planning? Maybe I have another member of my group who has a lot of uncertainty regarding the listed avalanche problems, and their real goal or desires for the day really just include getting outside because of COVID to enjoy some time with friends and get a little powder. Well, Roger Atkins, he wrote a 2014 paper, we're going to put it in the chat box there, on what he called strategic mindset for a snow science workshop. And we could do kind of a whole presentation just on this one topic, like a much bigger one than we have time for here. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds, but essentially he recognized in his heli ski operation that the morning meeting helped frame a terrain mindset for the day. And depending on, the weather and what they knew about the snowpack and the avalanche hazard, they would all decide as a group beforehand what runs would be open for the day and what terrain would be closed for the day. And he proposed that a mindset could actually become strategic when we make it more conscious and less automatic, and we deliberately associate it with a terrain strategy and start to talk about it in our regular communication. So this is kind of a way he thought we could align some of those desires I talked about before with terrain choices that align with the given avalanche hazard, and make sure we're kind of paying attention to those human factors in our decision making. So he kind of came up with a list of mindsets, essentially. And he first envisioned this for his heli ski company, but it was his vision that a version of this would be useful for recreational trips as well. And I'm going to do a really quick review of this list. You can find a more detailed list in the paper that was linked there. So the first thing he had is kind of this assessment mode. Think of this kind of when you're on a scouting mission. So maybe it's for an area that doesn't have an avalanche forecast, or maybe early season when we don't have a lot of information on what the snowpack and conditions are like yet. And it's going to include a terrain mindset that's going to use conservative, really make conservative terrain choices while we gather more information and confidence. And then he has another mindset we call the stepping out mindset, where this is when conditions are improving and we kind of consciously talk about how we're going to expand into maybe more dangerous or interact with more avalanche terrain. In status quo, we're kind of like same as yesterday. There's not a real big change in conditions, and we're already kind of using all of the terrain that we kind of selected on our last trip is very similar to the kind of terrain that we're going to interact with on our next trip. In the stepping back, we're going to be pulling back into safer terrain. The simplest example would be, when weather changes kind of increase the avalanche hazard. So you got, 30 centimeters of new snow. So maybe yesterday you were skiing 35 to 45 degree terrain. Well, with 30 plus centimeters of new snow, you're going to be pulling back into safer terrain choices with that mindset. And then we have entrenchment, which is kind of only really used when we have those persistent avalanche problems that last for long periods of time and have dangerous slabs. And they really limit our terrain choices, and we're going to be entrenched in pretty much almost staying out of avalanche terrain with wide margins of safety. And then in open season, most terrain is actually safe under this mindset, so we're going to be interacting quite aggressively with the terrain. And then the spring diurnal mindset, we adjust our mindset with the daily melt freeze cycle. And I'm going to give a few examples of those in a minute. So when we adopt the terrain mindset for a day as a group, it kind of frames our trip plan and decides in advance what kind of terrain we're going to engage with and what kind of terrain we're going to avoid. If we decided to avoid certain terrain features because of the mindset we adopted, we stick to that plan. Even if I get out into the field and I feel like, oh, maybe conditions are a little bit better than I anticipated, or maybe I just skied a line that was within our terrain mindset. It was super awesome. I feel really stoked. And now I'm looking at that slope just over there that's just a little bit steeper. And I'm like, hey guys, how do you feel about that? Well, when we adopt this terrain mindset, it should help us to prevent the human factors and those cumulative errors throughout the day that allow us to creep towards potential avalanche accidents. So essentially, if we decided to avoid a piece of terrain, we won't go there for the day, even if we feel like things are good. We'll use that kind of 24-hour rule, and tomorrow we can make a trip plan that includes that kind of terrain if we feel like conditions have changed enough. So another link kind of coming at you in the chat right now is this great article that came out this year by Colin Zacharias in Powder Cloud online publication. And with the help of some of these people, I think over on the left here, they have broken some of Roger Atkins' mindsets down into 4 kind of simpler mindsets for the day. They've got the check it out, keep it mellow, step it up, and time it early. And giving some terrain choices and how to approach the day for those different mindsets, and some really good kind of exercises in there too. So if some of this stuff for the rest of the presentation sparks your curiosity, this is a really good place to start, is with this article. So definitely bookmark that one. So I'm going to move on to a few examples of these from our fieldwork this season. I'm going to kind of start off in February, where we were dealing with a persistent avalanche problem in the southeast corner. I work in the Lizard Range Flathead Bulletin regions and the South Rockies. And we had a layer of surface hoar that was buried in late January, and we had at this time about 40 to 60 plus centimeters of snow on top of it. And by mid-February, we had over, I think, 50 min reports of avalanches on this layer, just in those forecast regions. Now, most were in the size 1.5 to 2 size, but remember, a size 2 avalanche is big enough to kill a person. Definitely more than big enough to ruin your day. And there were a few avalanches up to size 2.5. You know, bigger terrain was producing bigger avalanches. And human triggering of that layer was likely to very likely, and conservative terrain selection was essential. That's what the bulletin was telling us. There weren't a lot of new weather inputs. This was during that February cold snap that was pretty widespread throughout British Columbia. Maybe we just had some shifting wind directions. So unfortunately, it meant that we had to be in that entrenchment mindset. And we had to have a lot of self-control and discipline to deal with these well-established, persistent instabilities we were facing. It kind of sucks, but we had to value discipline over cleverness. This is some of the tips that are given with this particular mindset. You know, we could see time and time again in the min that we always get taught, oh, if avalanches are the problem, terrain is the solution. And sometimes we have a tendency to think like, well, I'm kind of an expert, so I could thread the needle around some steeper pieces of terrain. But with these avalanche problems, it's very unforgiving. And if you were touching terrain that was approaching kind of 30 degrees or connected to terrain that was 30 degrees, we were getting remote avalanches. So that left us with a very small selection of safe terrain. We really had to pull back to simple avalanche terrain under 30 degrees and kind of outline that as our terrain mindset for the day. And we also had to know that we were going to have to maintain this kind of beyond when evidence seemed to indicate it wasn't a concern anymore. Because with these types of problems, persistent problems, they often take more than a month to heal. And just 1 or 2 days of not having any avalanche reports on that layer is not enough to consider changing our mindset. So to shift our mindset and bring it in line with the realities of the layer, we had to kind of adjust our thinking and find ways to actually enjoy the terrain we had, because we had already determined that we're just not going to be skiing 40-degree pow slopes anytime soon. So, you know, trip plans of like learning how to wheelie in simple terrain, you know, could be something that's fun to do and fits into our mindset. No overhead hazard, no terrain traps, and using smaller features that couldn't bury us. And then, you know, part of our job is we're still going to trying to get avalanche information for the bulletins. And I said there wasn't a lot of new weather inputs, but we did have wind. So, you know, we were really double checking our trip plans during this time because there was just so much human triggered avalanche activity going on in the region. We were using things like FatMap. This is a slope angle shading overlay here to kind of double check our trip plans before we went out into the field to make sure, hey, are we doing what we said we're going to do? Avoid terrain and overhead hazard that's over 30 degrees. So here we could make, with entrenchment mindset and good trip planning, we could still kind of make a trip plan that allowed us to enjoy fresh air, exercise, and get relevant avalanche observations. And that's the kind of mindset we had to have, not I'm gonna ski rad stuff, because that was off the table. So unfortunately I can't play this video, but we were able to get up to the alpine, or sorry, the tree line and check out the new wind and see that it was forming kind of new growth on small cornice or windroll features. And we were also able to establish that these new little wind slabs weren't bonding well to those cold February facets. And that's another one of those persistent layers that Grant was talking about. But we were doing it all in terrain that wasn't capable of producing more than a size 0.5 avalanche in terrain under 30 degrees. Just kind of a look at it there. So by March, in kind of most regions, the persistent slabs were becoming more isolated, and the chances of avalanches on that layer were moving to kind of the unlikely, or possible to unlikely for triggering. So we were starting to adopt a stepping out mindset again, but it was a cautious or a small step out. And when we're doing these kind of steps out, so we're going to be kind of interacting with maybe a little bit of avalanche terrain now, lower angle slopes. Some of the advice is that we want to seek specific information about each piece of terrain before we're committing when we make those small steps out. So because we knew we were doing these small stepping out cautiously, it often meant we were having to kind of dig and check on particular slopes to see if that area actually had that surface hoar or those facet problems, and see how well they were bonding with the snow above. But like Grant said, just because we didn't get a result in the snowpack test, now that things were buried kind of 70 centimeters plus down, didn't mean we were just like, hey, it's good to go and we're jumping into big committing terrain. This is kind of around the same time as well, where early March, where we got our first big warm up for temperatures above zero. And like Grant spoke about, this is often a time where those persistent problems can wake up. So this photo is from a couple of years ago when we had a similar setup, but it was kind of the first warm day in March that temperatures got above zero, and lo and behold, we were able to trigger a layer that was 70 centimeters down in really mellow terrain from kind of 30 meters away. So it's just kind of that reminder that when we're taking those slow steps, those first steps out, it could be with a persistent slab problem or even with storm slabs. So you've waited a couple days and now you think, okay, it's going to go check out if things are getting better. When we're taking those first steps out, it's kind of important to consider choosing terrain where the consequences of our snowpack assessment being wrong will promote a survivable outcome. So that's kind of something to think about with those small steps out. Eventually, things in the kind of southeast here improved enough that in a lot of regions we kind of got to the status quo mindset when we were making trip plans, let's say in the southeast of the Purcells, places like that. We're more confident in conditions. We weren't having a lot of major changes in conditions or weather inputs. We'd kind of reached our comfort level with how much we were willing to expose ourselves with the current avalanche danger. We still have some uncertainties about a few deeper layers there, but we're interacting with and using avalanche terrain again. We're working around some of the problems like wind slabs, things like that as well. So I think it's just important to remind ourselves when we get to some of these avalanche forecasts and mindsets that support interacting more with avalanche terrain, like stepping out and status quo, we still need to make good trip plans. So I know some people are more visual learners. So I just kind of tried this out, this is an avalanche problem that I had pulled from the Purcells a couple of days ago. It's a wind slab problem. And it was in the Alpine is the elevation band. And the winds were coming from the southwest, so it was mostly loading the northerly and easterly slopes. And so we're experimenting using FatMap here, one of the custom filters that allows us to do a few things at once. So I could select an elevation band. So this is an Alpine, I kind of chose from 1,800 meters and up. And I picked slope angles over 30 degrees because that's when most avalanches happen. and just the aspects where there might be the wind slab problem. And what this allowed me to do is kind of paint the wind slab problem over the terrain. So I could look at a place like, say I was trying to go to Gorman here, when I'm making my trip plan, I could look and see, does this trip plan that I'm making match up with the avalanche conditions and my mindset? So maybe with our group, we've decided that we are going to we want to actually just avoid the wind slab problems completely and use other terrain selection. Well, now I can see if my trip plan, goes right through some of this green section, maybe I need to make another trip plan or look somewhere else, or what some of my decision points might be, or where is the terrain that avoids that problem. So just something interesting that you guys could maybe try out if you like to see kind of a visual picture of where those avalanche problems might be when you're making your trip plans. So when we have a lot of confidence in the avalanche hazard, and we're really only expecting small isolated avalanches as a possibility, we can adopt more of this open season mindset that allows us to plan trips that involve extensive terrain use, even in steep committing terrain, providing we have the skills to actually ride that. We need to ride within our abilities. However, this open season mindset does not mean that we can cut corners on our daily process. We still need to maintain good habits. And this is taken from Parks Bulletin a couple of days ago. And they're reminding us of that right in the headline, kind of maintain good habits and situational awareness. So what are those good habits? So if we look at our daily process here, it reminds us in the field, that's something we should be doing every day. So just because you see green on the Avalanche Bulletin, or we've adopted this open season mindset, doesn't mean that we should, have lunch underneath a cornice that's baking in the sun, or we should continue to have only one person on the slope at a time when we're skiing our lines or sledding in big terrain. So we also need to kind of maintain that situational awareness, that we're kind of constantly updating our mental map of the terrain and verifying the conditions, because maybe the wind is loading slopes, the wind is maybe more than was forecast for, and now it's loading the slope that we're thinking of skiing. And even a very small avalanche, if I have picked a committing line, could have really serious consequences. So I need to constantly be updating my situational awareness, even in this kind of open season mindset. And then that kind of brings us to a typical one in March, is the spring diurnal mindset. And when we're adopting this mindset, the group will determine at the outset that they need to plan a trip that acknowledges that terrain use may have to shift during the day. So when things freeze up overnight, there may be more of an open season mindset, and we might set out earlier in the morning if we have big objectives, maybe even in the dark. But by the afternoon, we may have to do a stepping back mindset into more mellow terrain, or limit our terrain use to slopes that are more shaded. So this is just an example from a trip, not this year, but later in March trip from our field team, where we didn't have a lot of other avalanche problems. The sun was the major driver of the avalanche hazard that day. And we got there early, and we were able to kind of get into some bigger terrain with our sleds. But when things started to heat up on those south-facing slopes, we had to get off of that terrain and kind of pull back and look more towards north-facing slopes. So we limited, instead of being able to use all the terrain, we could only use north-facing slopes as we got into the afternoon, where the snow was still dry. But even with that, we made sure we weren't playing under any big cornices. This might kind of look like a cornice, but it's actually just a little wind lip there. It's not actually overhanging. And there are no big cornices overhead. But even with all of that said, we were back at our trucks by 3 o'clock and kind of out of avalanche terrain, leaving avalanche terrain around 2 o'clock, because that's when things really started to warm up. So we kind of have to think about in that spring diurnal cycle, we may have various mindsets throughout the day according to that melt freeze cycle. So just to kind of wrap things up here, we have this complex snowpack and warm weather potentially making weak layers more sensitive to triggering in March. That combined with kind of long days and more people in the backcountry make March a deadly month for avalanches. So I think ensuring that we're kind of following that daily process and not cutting corners should help protect us a bit from some of the problems we could encounter in March. And then I think it'd be cool if we checked out some of the information on mindset to see if it helps you in your communication to get some of those human factors like the blue sky syndrome and the fact that we're all kind of chomping at the bit to do stuff together with COVID. See if we can keep some of those expectations for the day more in check and discuss them more openly with our partners. And then it sucks that this one always gets left to the end, but I'm going to squeak it in here as well. The last part of the daily process is reflecting on our day. And I think a lot of us that work in the avalanche industry, we do this as part of our end of day meeting. I even had a sticky in our truck to remind us to start talking about it on the way home. Because just because we didn't trigger an avalanche didn't mean that we made perfect decisions that day. So we ask ourselves some tough questions like, hey, we made a terrain mindset in the morning. Did we actually stick with it? You know, when were we most at risk today? Or did I do anything in the day that made you, kind of my partner, feel uncomfortable? Asking ourselves those kinds of questions will really help protect us in March from not kind of pushing those boundaries and thinking, you know, just because we came home safely, we made perfect decisions. And that said, even if we have, you know, small near misses or we see recent avalanches, kind of writing those things down in the min at the end of the day helps our reflective process, and it also helps other people, our avalanche community, our backcountry community, be stronger because we share that kind of slope and drainage specific information, and it also benefits the avalanche forecasters as well. So yeah, another plug for the Mountain Information Network there. And squeak one more dog photo in there. You can use the raise your hand function or just put questions in the chat box, and maybe Grant will pop back up too and we can see what kind of questions you might have for us.
Hey, Jen, I do have a question that came in from Lo. Can you speak on the size 3 avalanche on fissile yesterday, aspect, what it slid on, etc.?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually have broken ribs right now, so I've been off for a few days. I did see the article in the Peak there, and I am connected with some search and rescue stuff, but not on the coast. I actually don't have any specific information on that particular avalanche, but Grant could maybe talk to what some of the avalanche problems are that we've generally been seeing on the coast, but I don't know if we have information on that specifically.
Yeah, you know, beyond what's in the Peak, we don't have more information. I think that that's a pretty comprehensive article, and we can drop that into the chat there. And I bet just kind of knowing some of the folks who are in that, some big names that are frequently around, I bet we'll learn more about that one as time goes on here. But unfortunately, don't have much more to offer at this point.
Yeah, you might make a min report, or we might get some more information sent to us directly.
I don't have other questions in the chat box. Anybody have? Oh, yes, I do. Here's one from Conrad. If there is an expected large change of temperature during the course of the day, but still remaining below 0, is it recommended to finish early?
Grant, or I can go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that anytime there's a large temperature swing, it's, you know, we think about the mountains, a really dynamic environment. So where is it actually going to be zero? Like where is that forecast temperature coming from? Because if it's, is that a valley bottom zero, or is it an alpine zero? Is it a shaded zero? I think if you're starting to get temperatures near zero, it's probably time to start thinking about bringing the day home early, and also really thinking about what kind of aspects that you're on. So are you on big solar aspects like south or west facing features, or there cornices above you? Anytime there's a big change in the snowpack and it's rapid, it's time to shut down early. If you start getting into that kind of daily cycle, and honestly, BC has many great things, but it's not the greatest corn skiing in the world. You got to go east for that, and that's when the Rockies in Alberta get phenomenal for their corn cycle. But it's an early thing. Even when it only gets to about zero, you still need to be back early. Jen, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's good. Just that the snowpack doesn't like, rapid change, like you said. So if you're getting like a, 7 or 8 degree warm up over a short period of time, even if the sun wasn't out, I'd be thinking about dialing back my terrain choices into smaller pieces of terrain that weren't connected, or maybe kind of getting out of there early, like you said as well. And then I don't know if everybody knows, maybe Grant would be good at explaining it, what corn snow actually is. I mean, not technically, but just like as a concept.
Yeah, it's deeply nerdy, but it's pretty interesting. So corn snow is just when the snow surface goes through a cycle of kind of melting and refreezing, and as it melts, all of the neighboring bonds they grow together. They start to get these large crystals, and it's named corn because it's like a kernel of corn. They start to get quite big. And so when it's frozen, it's great traction for skinning or cramponing or sledding for that matter too. But you can kind of go straight up things when it's nicely refrozen. And the name of the game with corn skiing and riding is that you want to be descending just as it's starting to unfreeze. And when it's doing that, when that first centimeter or two are just unfreezing, like it's amazing how much hold it has. It's very safe from an avalanche perspective. So you can be like just having this incredible skiing. It's very positive and engaging. And the idea is that you're off things before the whole thing starts to unfreeze. So you just ski it when it's just when the surface is just unfreezing. The caveat is that it happens at different times on different aspects during the day. You need to make sure you have a pretty good overnight refreeze for the whole process to work. And the one thing to think about is if you're on a really big line and you're sitting at the top of it waiting for it to unfreeze, well, what's it doing in the middle of your line or that valley bottom? So it can be a really difficult thing to time, but it is a lot of fun. And many people say that the real Rockies ski season starts in May for that reason, because you can just go out and ride these incredible features, kind of as Jen spoke about, with this diurnal cycle, being on them early, being off them early, and you can get into some big country, and the only thing you're really worried about is objective hazard or fall risk. Jen?
Yeah, I think that's good. It's something we didn't kind of touch on that happens in the spring too, is when we don't get those overnight freezes and the snowpack really starts to warm up, and the temperatures within the snowpack get to be kind of zero from the ground all the way up. The snowpack loses all its strength and structure, and that's when we start to get into those big wet loose avalanche cycles that can be really big and destructive too, when we don't get those overnight freezes and it loses kind of all its strength. And they may not have big powder clouds or move that quickly, but they're hugely destructive. You definitely don't want to get caught in one. It'd be next to impossible to escape. Often take out trees and things like that as well, if they get big enough. So, those loose wet avalanches can get bigger when we don't have those overnight refreezes than just those kind of smaller wet loose avalanches we might have so far seen in the season.
Yeah, well
Thanks, you
said.
guys. I've got a couple of questions related to slope angle. If you could define steep and moderate or lower angled as referred to in slopes, And then is there a good tool to use for slope angle and how safe a slope would be to ski?
Those are really good questions. And I think like when I'm making trip plans and trying to communicate with people, because like it gets tricky, like not everybody has the same definition of low slope angles or moderate slope angles. So sometimes I think it's just easier to say, you know, we're going to stay off slopes under 35 degrees because 35 degrees is a definite thing. It's a measurable thing. Now, kind of how to train yourself for that. I mean, I think some of those slope angle tools are good trip planning tools, but you know, I'm not going to stand there and look at it in the field and necessarily trust that. There are some pieces of equipment, clinometers that can help you measure slope angle in the field. I think it's really good exercise to practice. Like I know as a field team, we kind of practice when we're doing profiles or things like, what do you think the slope angle is? And we have to like say it out what it is, and then we actually measure it to see what the actual slope angle is. So we're kind of constantly refining that, because I think, you know, like I kind of started at a ski hill, and you get used to being in steep terrain all the time and being pretty comfortable with it and thinking, oh, it's not that steep. But like, you know, it's easy to kind of think 38-degree terrain is kind of no big deal. But with certain avalanche conditions, 38-degree terrain is definitely avalanche terrain. So yeah, I think that's some of the tips that I have for slope angle. Can't remember if I answered that. Maybe Grant can bail me out on what I didn't answer.
Yeah, no, that was great. I think the clinometer, but most good compasses also have a slope angle measurement tool that you can use. One thing that I've used a lot in the backcountry when I'm looking at big slopes straight on, and I have no idea why it works, but if you tilt your head to the side and look at it, you can actually get a better read on it. So if you're looking at like some big steep face in front of you, for some reason tilting your head to the side actually helps you put it in scale more. I don't know why that works. But yeah, that game that we play all the time is just like, how steep is this? And then measuring it. I would agree with Jen. Like I would say that really mellow is like 30 or less. You know, that as Jen well said, like kind of classic avalanche terrain is kind of that 35 to 38 or 40. And if it starts to exceed 40 is when I start to call it like.
Yeah, sorry. I had a train of thought there, but I did lose it. Maybe I'll remember it again at some point.
Thanks, you guys. Question, in your experience, how accurate actually are slope angle on maps, on FatMap or Gaia, especially when dealing with a lot of micro terrain?
Oh, that reminded me of my point, so thank you. Like I say, I would use that as a trip planning tool in the like planning stages, but I would not be walking around, you know, like trying to say like, oh, it says I'm in this terrain, you know, on my phone. I would be looking at the terrain and measuring the terrain. And like you just alluded to, there's a lot of micro terrain features. And I think sometimes that gets us into trouble, because what I see, I've seen it myself too, especially when we're kind of route finding in the trees can be one of the toughest times for this. Maybe dealing with something like surface hoar problems or whatever. The overall slope angle might be 30 degrees, but there may be little places in that run that have little breakovers or convexities that are definitely more than 30 degrees. And that's often where we initiate those avalanches accidentally. And if it's kind of on a treed slope, I just use that example because the consequences are worse, because we often can hit trees and things on the way down. And I think that, you know, I'm much less confident on sighting or like just like, you know, deciding, oh, I'm going to ski this treed run when I'm kind of in those entrenchment mindsets or those stepping back mindsets, because there's probably a good likelihood, even if the slope angle is 30 degrees, that somewhere in there, there's little steeper parts. So I'm going to allow wider margins of safety, or even pick an open slope where the consequences of, you know, being wrong if there's a little convexity wouldn't have those same consequences. I mean, it depends on the avalanche problem, but I don't hold true and fast to those Gaia and FatMap things, but use them more as a planning tool, get a general sense.
Great, thanks. There's a question about couloirs. How best can you manage couloirs with warming? Are they better for spring skiing?
Be damn early. Have a good pulse on what's going on with couloirs, because more often than not, you're going straight up them, which obviously puts you in the path of that thing. You're exposed oftentimes the whole time going up, especially in the Rockies where there's a lot of rad couloirs to go and ski. So you need to have you need to be real confident in your assessment that it is the time you can go and ski those sort of things. Having a good overnight refreeze, and then just being early. Like the corn is served before 11 a.m. for sure, depending on aspect. But up early, down early, beers at noon, home and back and in bed at 8, so you can get up and do it again the next day.
And another question you touched on, why, if the forecast is generally low, will danger rapidly increase as soon as we get a bit of warming?
I think that's a good question for Grant, and talk about how we kind of handle that in the bulletins when we really get into those hardcore spring diurnal cycles.
Yeah, it is, as an organization and in tandem with all the other avalanche forecast centers in North America, we've all agreed to actually rate the danger for the highest part of the day. And so that can be really confusing. And to be totally honest, it's debatable, but that's what we do. And we've all agreed to do it. So while you might see considerable in the forecast, get into the details, read the avalanche problem, because it's going to talk to you about when that is going to be, because we're rating that danger for the highest part of the day. Whereas earlier in the talk this evening, Jen spoke really well about what it means when the whole snowpack kind of goes isothermal, or one temperature, and gets into that big mushy mess where you step out of your skis or step off your sled and you just kind of sink up to your waist in wet grains. That's time to just not be there, period. If that's happening, you should have been long gone. So that's actually what we're rating in the forecast, is that part of the day. But if you're, like right now, the sun comes into my window at about 5:40 here in Revelstoke. And like this, for instance, this morning I had some friends who went and skied a big line on Mount Begbie, and they were long gone by 5:40. I bet they were already halfway up the thing. So it's just about going early, taking advantage of those good refreezes, so that when the temperature does warm up, you're just clear of avalanche terrain. And also recognizing too that with those kind of things, even in the spring, like you can still have small wind slabs in extreme alpine features that can be problematic. Like a size 1 wind slab, not that big a deal in a lot of places. But if you're in the start zone of a steep couloir and it washes over you as you're climbing it, like it's a big deal. So, you're playing the ski mountaineering game, and you're playing for keeps when you start getting into those kind of lines. So just making sure you have a really good understanding. And it's like going and skiing the raddest couloir on the block isn't the first thing that I do when I show up in a new area too. I think that Jen spoke about assessment, initial assessment, getting out there and kind of like, if you're from somewhere in the interior, you're going up to ski couloirs in the Rockies for the week, like go have an easy day and get a feel of snowpack, dig lots of shallow holes, like get some local knowledge, and then you can start to step it up and step out, as she was speaking to, gradually.
There's another question on timing, and I don't think you can actually put a time on it. The question is, how different would you say your exit timing would need to be between north and south facing slopes on a sunny day?
Go for it, Coulter.
Well, I mean, of course, like I said, the answer is always, it depends. There could be days where you would want to be off south facing slopes by midday, but north facing slopes actually stay cool all day. Or we could be into the kind of thing where we're not getting really good overnight refreezes, and south facing slopes are already at that kind of, I'm going to say like isothermal, or they're too mushy to touch at all. But north facing slopes, there may be kind of one more day where there's decent quality snow, but by the end of the day, the ambient temperature is enough that, you know, even north facing stuff is deteriorating. So yeah, I mean, it just kind of depends, because yeah, some days you could avoid south facing stuff and use north facing stuff all day, but some days maybe not. I don't know with greenhousing, I don't know if that's too bad to get into that too. It's not even just sunny days where that can be a problem when we get into the spring.
A question from Linda. Are avalanches on well-treed slopes typically smaller than on open slopes? I frequently debate the likelihood or size potential of avalanches below tree line with my ski partners.
I mean, that is a good question. You know, when we get into like surface horror problems, you know, often people feel safest in the trees, but that's not necessarily the best place to be with some avalanche problems. Super tight trees, maybe that surface horror needs some view of the night sky, so it doesn't actually grow well in super tight trees, so that might be okay below tree line. But sometimes there's kind of openings below tree line, and I think as recreationists, we're kind of attracted to those openings below tree line, because that's where it's easiest to sled, ski, hike, do all of those things. And those may be areas that do have those problems. And I wish I had a photo too, but it is interesting that in the spring below tree line, even on some south facing slopes that are quite heavily treed, same with when we get some rain on snow events, we definitely can get some wet, loose avalanches running on that kind of stuff. And it looks surprising because there's not really an avalanche path there, but if there's a road or a hiking trail, those can kind of act as terrain traps and make even those small avalanches a bigger problem below tree line in the spring.
Great, thanks. I have one last question, I think, from Conrad. Why would ski mountaineer lines be more accessible in March?
Well, the big lines take a deep snowpack to fill in, for one thing. So things that might just be like a giant hanging cliff or srac fall in December, you know, you add 3 meters of snow to that, and it might just become a nice smooth slope. It's also in some of that rowdy, extreme terrain, it's much harder to get in there in a true midwinter snowpack when you're actually dealing with kind of that cold, dry snowpack where you might have buried weak layers that are human triggerable. And in the spring, this melt freeze cycle that we've been talking about, this diurnal cycle, it actually adds a lot of strength to the snowpack, and it changes it so it all behaves as one. And that's kind of what isothermal means, one temperature. And so you can get into those things when it's had a few nights, especially as you start to get into like days and weeks of that, you start to get into it like what's actually a very strong snowpack when it's frozen. And so that's why you can start getting into those lines, because you're not really worried about deeper layers in the snowpack until it unfreezes. You know, and so any kind of new snow that you might be thinking about, like, which does happen, of course, in April, like you're really worried about the new snow, and you're not really so much worried about like the deep persistent slabs. And those things are going to be well covered in the forecast as well. But those are the reasons you can start to go and get into that bigger terrain with less risk when it's frozen from avalanches, because you're not dealing with a classic winter snowpack.
Awesome. That's great, you guys. That's it from the chat box from me.
There's these 2 books that when I was like in the heyday of my ski mountaineering, this was one of them that I really like. It's a Mountaineers. It's probably a newer version than this one, to be honest. But it's this cat, Martin Volken, who's an American from the Northwest that gets into all sorts of just great techniques for really getting after it. And then of course, like this is a very dog-eared Bruce Tremper staying alive in avalanche terrain. He gets into how to play that game in the spring in that book too. And those things they're frequently referenced by me still, so much that I can just lean over and grab them off the bookshelf as I did there. So if you're keen, those are great texts to get into. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much to Nancy and Brent and Jen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Grant and Jen. Good job, you guys. And wow, you know, what an excellent reminder of the hazards that we're dealing with coming up, as well as, you know, working on the proper mindset to get out there when you're heading into the backcountry. You know, it's pretty easy to let your guard down right now. It's a beautiful sunny day. You're out there, blue skies. Everyone's got that COVID fatigue, and you might be out hanging out with a couple folks you haven't been with. But it's super important to know what those active weak layers might be out there in the snowpack. And if you haven't been riding all year, you know, on a regular basis or just occasionally out there, it's super important to do your research. Get your trip planning down. Go visit avalanche.ca, one-stop shop for all that avalanche information. Check out the bulletins for your region. See if there's some new min posts or even older posts that are talking about some events or weak layers or happenings out there that you may not be aware of before you go out there. We also have forecaster blogs on there that people will be talking about, you know, get the forecasters out there chatting about things that are, you know, in their mind's eye that are key to be important right now in certain periods coming up. Check that stuff out. There's so many resources on there before you even leave your home. Just hit the website avalanche.ca, and if you need a refresher on a whole bunch of jargon that these guys were talking about, Avi Savvy, it's our online tutorial. You can hit that up. We super appreciate you guys coming out tonight. You know, everybody wants to get out there. Everybody really enjoys getting out there, and you folks, you can support us. Donations are accepted to Avalanche Canada. We're a nonprofit organization. We're super stoked to get the information out to you guys. The webinars have been going all winter. This was number 17. We got a couple more happening to wrap up the season. Next Thursday, March 18th, Behind the Gram. It's going to be a youth-focused panel discussion. Everybody's invited. You got to pre-register. So once again, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. It's super great having you. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Grant. Nancy, thank you in the background there. We hope you all have a safe spring as winter is passing us by here. And stay safe out there and have a great night.